right, welcome to Diverse Joy, a podcast that infuses science, practical skill, and most of all, joy into the conversations around diversity. My co-host is the courageous, resourceful, and skillful Dr. William Cox.
And my co-host is the noble and valiant, just as a pink and green clad Jedi for this May episode.
Absolutely.
Oh, Dr. Amber Nelson.
Yes, that's my name. That's my name.
And so it's May, which has our producer's birthday, May the 4th, which is also Star Wars Day. May the 4th be with you, Amber.
May, and also with you.
So we're both dressed up in kind of Star Wars-y, but in our signature colors of pink and green.
Absolutely.
Which in the first season we discovered are our mutual favorite colors.
Right, exactly.
And favorite color combination.
Yeah. So we've got a lot of pink and greeny themed things, which is great. We love it. We love that.
Outfits, and if you look at our nonprofit's logo, the Inequity Agents of Change logo, it's kind of like a network-ish brain design with pink and green nodes in the network. And if you can see our mugs
are also pink and green.
So like anytime Roman asks us something about like color, we're like, well, obviously pink and green.
It's obviously pink and green. Obviously pink and green. Yes.
But anyway, so
that should be one of our joys. Pink and green.
I think we've just explained it. So
we did.
You get extra joy from us this episode.
It's true.
But so getting more onto our formal official joys this episode. Amber, what's bringing you joy this May?
You know, I mean, it is Star Wars month day. And so I think it's fitting to talk about going to Star Wars night at Disney with you all.
Your mom.
And my mom. And we went to, so for those of you who are unfamiliar, we talked a little bit about Jollywood night at Disney, but Disney has these kind of after hours nights and that are themed for different things, Pride night and Star Wars night and Jollywood and what is it? Oogie Boogie Bash, which is at Halloween time. So they kind of close down the park after hours and make it fully themed. There are extra parades and fireworks and all kinds of activities. The lines are really low.
Special
talk
food.
about the special food, and merchandise, things like that, and photo opportunities and special characters that come out that don't come out during the day. And so we went for Star Wars night, or well, I guess it technically wasn't the 4th, but
it was the week of the 4th.
It was the week of the 4th, and
it was season of the 4th. April and May.
Yes. And it was just incredible. I had never done one of the special nights before. And so we all got dressed up. I was dressed as Rey. And we did the lightsaber meetup, and there's a whole scene that happened around us, and we got to be part of it.
And your mom was dressed as Ahsoka?
My mom was dressed as Ahsoka, and we just really got to get into it. And it's just another level. And being around other folks that really love Star Wars, just as much as me, but better barometer is just as much as the boys do, as Will and Roman do, because they really love Star Wars and know all of the whole world. And so it's just a really cool experience to go and be around other enthusiasts and dressed up and get to see the characters and interact with, Queen Amidala and Anakin and, just everything. It was just so cool. Yeah.
It was a blast.
It was such a blast. Yeah.
And Roman and I love the cool merchandise that we got.
So much merchandise. There's so many things happening. And like I said, all the photo opportunities and just being interactive with other guests, but also the characters that come out and the theme and the music and everything. It was so immersive. So it was very, very cool.
Special food. They had so many tasty snacks.
Yeah. I had a Wookiee cookie, and that was delicious. all the things. So yeah, that's my joy for this month. How about you, Will?
Can I interject really quick?
Yeah, please.
So since you mentioned my birthday being May 4th, as a lifelong Star Wars fan, it is very weird to me that in the last 10 years, my birthday has become a Star Wars holiday.
It's amazing.
Because it never used to be.
It never used to be. Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I love that for you, Eric Roman.
Thank you.
It's quite perfect.
Awesome. So my joy, since we're dressed up as Star Wars, I was like, I'll do a Star Wars thing too. So Amber's kind of mentioned once or twice my house, my and Eric Roman's house, and how we have it kind of decorated and crafted. But over the years, we've kind of been like, oh, we want to do a Star Wars room. Yeah. Like, so one of our bathrooms we have where it looks like it's a building on Tatooine where we kind of curved the ceiling so it doesn't look as boxy, and kind of put in various decorations. Maybe Roman will have pictures. It's not done yet, but then we were like, okay, when we were remodeling our kitchen, we had to get a new dishwasher, and we were looking at the different dishwashers, and one of them has the kind where you can get a false front on it, which is so that it can match your cabinets. Right. But instead, so we got that one, but instead of a front that matches the cabinets, Roman actually built a front for it where it looks like a control panel from the Death Star. Right. So control panel from Star Wars. Yes. And we mentioned in our very first episode when we went on the Star Cruiser, which was just a really amazing experience. Incredible. If anyone doesn't remember what I'm talking about, it was kind of a 2-day adventure that Disney had where you were in the Star Wars universe on a ship, and like in the hotel, instead of windows, the windows were like really high def screens that looked like you were looking out at space, and they were really beautiful. And one day I just kind of texted Roman. I was looking at this blank space we had in a wall above our kitchen sink, actually. And I was like, what if there was a window right there into space? And he built this amazing window around a special television set that we bought, that it's called the Samsung Frame, not branded content. It just happens to be a fact. But what's special about this TV is when you turn it off, it using very, very little electricity, which is important for, environmentalism and all that. Basically like a screensaver on the screen, it shows pictures. And so he built a frame around it so it looks like it's this space window with like knobs and special lights all around the frame. But then in the frame, it plays pictures from space in Star Wars, from Star Wars movies and TV shows. And so every time you look at it, it's like, you're seeing spaceships, Star Wars spaceships. And it just, sometimes I just sit there and look at it and I'm like, oh, I feel happy.
It is quite incredible. I feel like every time I come into the house, there's something new and fun to explore and see and find, and all the Star Wars just details and every piece. And if I have not already said it, which I know I have, and I will continue to say how talented both of you are, and Eric Roman's just talent for building and creating these pieces. When you say like, oh, I want to have a window here, like they could just figures it out and makes it like perfect and perfectly like sized and has all of the details that are in line with the Star Wars universe. Is just really, really incredible.
Yeah, and I know it sounds really nerdy, and it is, but
there's nothing wrong with that.
I think I have really good ideas and not really much execution, and then Roman can just execute everything to perfection. That's and amazing. It's nerdy, and some people who aren't as nerdy as us might not quite get it. But whenever I see one of those things, it's Star Wars. Part of why it's so successful and so many people love it is its aesthetic.
Right.
So 100%. It's just a very different alien kind of aesthetic, but still kind of has that appeal. And for people who grew up with it, like the original trilogy was before I was born. It's been a part of my life, and just whenever I see those things, I'm like, oh, that's very Star Wars. Yeah. So yeah.
Well, it brings you joy. Yeah. And like, I think, I was listening to somebody recently talking about actually especially interior design, and how we've moved, especially millennials moved to like this kind of very gray, very like white, plain aesthetic because like it helps with the quote unquote resale value later on. But like, why are we thinking about when I'm leaving or moving? Like we need to take the time to create your space as unique as possible so that you can enjoy it and it brings you joy in every little nook and cranny that you look at when you're in your space.
Yeah. And what you're saying is how we approached buying our house when we were doing that. You know, people were talking about like, oh, a starter home sort of a thing. And we were like, nope. Like we said, we knew that we were going to do weird things to the house. We already were into like smart lights and things like that. And we were like, no, we're going to be doing stuff that is just for us. Like we're trying to commit to a forever home. So that we could do a lot of these things. And then having that level of commitment, like not thinking, oh, I'm going to have to pack this up in a few years, maybe. Which often people think that, and then maybe it never happens. But anyway,
out on the opportunities, right? Yeah.
So it's a good way to, well, for us to kind of commit and live in, and even people who aren't into Star Wars, they come and they're like, but they appreciate it.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say, was that even if you aren't a Star Wars person, like you can really enjoy this space just as much as anybody else because they appreciate what you all have done. I mean, you have a lightsaber on the table.
Yes. So I think the cameras are picking it up, but for our little lightsabers, he built a lightsaber stand for one of them. And we put it on the table in front of Amber. And so we're done sharing joys, but when we put the lightsaber on the table, it made me think of some research that when I mentioned it, we thought it might be interesting to share.
Yeah.
This is before we get into our main topic of intergenerational stuff. But back in the day, researchers who studied aggression, like physical behavioral aggression, had this theory called the frustration aggression hypothesis, which is basically this idea that aggression always comes from a frustrated emotional state. Interesting. And also, when you had a frustrated emotional state, it always led to either aggression or at least an impulse for aggression. So that frustration and aggression were inherently fundamentally linked no matter what. And that is, they are linked. But it was this idea that aggression always comes from frustration. And a professor in my old department, where I got my PhD at UW-Madison Psychology Department, a professor from there named Leonard Berkowitz, who he was retired by the time I was there, but he stayed involved, and I met him several times. He read some of my papers and was very supportive and interested in my career. So he's passed now, but I always had a special place in my heart for Len. He came along. He was like, this frustration aggression hypothesis can account for many instances of aggression, but I think there's more to it. And he did a bunch of studies, but basically he developed a different model, or a complementary model of aggression called the neo-association model of aggressive behavior. And basically, in some of the kind of most classic, most famous studies, what he did is he brought people into the lab, and he had a weapon, like kind of just sitting on the table, like kind of a messy area where it's like, oh, just ignore that or something. But then showed that being exposed to a weapon, it activates ideas in your mind related to aggression, and that can lead to aggressive behavior. Interesting. And so it doesn't have to stem from frustrated emotion. You can have a cognitive pathway that just kind of seeing a weapon on the table leads people to actually behave more aggressively than people who are in a different condition of the experiment and they don't see that. And so just kind of having this lightsaber on the table.
I was gonna say, so I'm gonna ask you to like ignore the lightsaber and not be aggressive.
But also just Star Wars trivia. For Jedi, lightsabers are supposed to be weapons of defense, not offense.
Yes, it's true.
But also, it would depend on when you see it. What do you think?
What do you think it is? Yep.
And how do you think of it as a weapon
right?
Attack
or defense? Yeah.
And I this is just me speculating now, so I'm stepping outside of any actual science. I wonder with like fictional weapons like a lightsaber, do you associate them with the aggression because you see lightsaber fight scenes, or is it like, oh, it's Star Wars? Wars, and maybe you
Right.
don't think of that as an aggressive.
Right.
I don't know. There could be something there.
It's a good question. Or do you just see it as a stick?
toy.
A toy.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
So,
that's great.
and
That's really
lightsabers are very associated with meditation and stuff in Star Wars. So there could be other things there, but
great. Absolutely.
but yeah, just exposure to seeing guns. It was a gun in the
weapons.
original weapons. Can activate ideas of aggression that can influence behavior, and that goes back to something we've talked about in but basically every episode. These habits of mind or these
Absolutely.
automatically activated associations, and how they can influence our behavior.
Right.
Doesn't mean if you see a gun, you instantly get aggressive.
Right.
Necessarily.
Right.
It, again, interacts with other things.
Absolutely.
But
and our associations with them.
yeah. So that was a little just extra science talk.
Extra tidbit
little bit
there
on the
for you.
history of kind of science of aggression.
Yeah.
All right. So that was our little kind of extra science talk with Will and Amber. But now we're getting into our main topic. So our main topic today, Amber's going to take a bit of a lead on it, but it's intergenerational trauma and especially healing, and also healing from it. But we have to kind of understand it, get that salty part of our diverse joy sandwich, so that we can then put
some vegan mayo, some mustard. Yes.
Yeah. So, Amber, what are we talking about with intergenerational trauma?
Yeah, I think that is an interesting topic because I wanted to bring it up because it's really tied to collective trauma as well, right? And I think collective trauma is both related to intergenerational pieces, but also what is currently happening and how groups are really connected to that. And so the idea of intergenerational trauma is that there are traumas that happen within groups, particularly marginalized and oppressed groups, that they experience. And as a result of that, whether that's a style of food or hair or ways in which they interact with healthcare, things like that, that kind of get passed down from generation to generation. And that can happen from a habit of mind, but it can also be physical manifestations of trauma too. So we see things in Holocaust survivors, generations past, Holocaust kids, grandkids having really higher levels of mental health concerns and things like that. And we see a lot of these things that happened without necessarily having experienced a specific trauma, but that there are these lasting, lingering effects of something that happened to your ancestors.
And there are multiple pathways of 100%. That. So sorry if I'm stealing your point, but different ways we can think about that. So one is epigenetics.
Yes.
So when you experience trauma, it can actually kind of change the expression of your genes in your body. And then later when you have kids, it turns on or off various genes that maybe you needed to physically survive the trauma or cope with the trauma or what have you. And then in your kids, those genes are turned on or off depending on which ones we're talking about. When they're then not in the same sort of traumatic environment or having the same experiences, but then these physical and also cognitive mental sorts of sequelae is one of the fancy words, but consequences will be active for them. Yes. So that's one pathway. We're just kind of this purely biological sort of thing. And the other is kind of learned.
Yes.
So, going through a trauma, a parent, or the person who's ultimately becomes the parent, finds a behavioral way to cope with something, or they develop a mental habit through the trauma, and then they maintain that, and the kids kind of learn from that.
100%.
And this isn't fully the level of trauma you're talking about, but one way I think of this is with women and kind of self-talk about their bodies. So young girls hear their moms saying things like, "Oh, I'm so fat," or "I don't like how I look," and so on. And then the girls, even if the mothers aren't trying to teach that to their daughters, which is also a thing that can happen, but the girls hear how their mothers are talking about themselves, and so then the girls start emulating that, and then body image issues kind of pass from generation to generation.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think about things like even corporal punishment in certain communities, like Black communities. And there's a whole, I'll have to find her name, researcher that talks about how while it is really common in, like, say, Black communities specifically, the idea of spare the rod, spoil the child, that she actually talks about how corporal punishment in Black communities specifically is actually the whitest thing that we can do to Black children, which is a whole thing. But really where it started from, right, was during, slave times, that like the punishment for not obeying or things like that was corporal, right? And being beat. And so the idea was that I have to be harder on my kids so that they know how to listen. They know what to expect, because it's going to be far worse if they don't do it now. So I'm going to do this and inflict this on my kids.
And this is among the enslaved people, historically.
Right.
But
and then that has been passed down. Right, exactly. And then we continue to see it a lot in the community, because the world, particularly in the US, like we still get kind of this negative punishment, and so we still see it happening in the community. And so I think that, yes, Stacey Patton, thank you. Spare the kids, why whipping children won't save Black America. And she really talks about how that is, she talks about the historical implications of this and where and how we've gotten to where we are.
And can I give a shout out back to several episodes ago when we were here with Bernie Hose, and we were talking about kind of writing and composition. Like the title has the word whooping in it, WHUPPING, which it's to my immediate reaction is it's not standard English, so to speak. It's a very kind of Black American English phrase. And so I'm very curious to check out this book and see, was she able to kind of cross that border or that line that we were talking about with Bernie of, standard American English versus African American English, and keeping her voice, especially because I assume she's trying to appeal to Black readers.
She's appealing to the community and the folks that speak in this way. So I think it's important. And I've only read bits and pieces of it, but to maintain that language and that voice is really, really important. But when thinking about that intergenerational trauma, those pieces that are learned, right? There are things that are learned that started back during slave times that then morphed and shifted, but still maintained because of some of those messages, both physical, mental, emotional, spiritual messages that were imparted and then shifted and passed down through the generations.
In addition to epigenetics, so that's where your kind of genetic expression is changed by things that have happened, and then kind of learning or environmental kinds of things where, something that a way your parents do something, you learn it from them explicitly. There's also kind of a third that was hinted at in some of what you talked about, which is actual genetics. So not just epigenetics, where it's changing the expression of genes, but genetics, or how in the kind of evolutionary sense that we think of them, where certain genes, certain people survive to pass on genes. And so in the African American community, there's something called the slavery hypothesis for hypertension, which is saying that so there's a lot of hypertension in the Black American community, more than in the white community. And there are different hypotheses and ideas about it, but one of them is that there might have been what some people call a genetic bottleneck during slavery. So either when the enslaved Africans were brought over from Africa and had long journeys on these boats without proper nutrition, or some of the conditions as enslaved people in the Old South. Some of this hypothesis is saying that maybe genetics for kind of retaining salts would have been selected for. So people whose genetics didn't retain salt as much would have been more likely to die. Those who did retain salt were more likely to survive and then pass on those genes. And so then now for the modern African American community, which is by and large mostly descended from enslaved people, they have this propensity to retain salts, which contribute contributes to hypertension and other problems.
Right.
So just to be clear, that's not genes getting turned on and off by trauma. That's just which genes get passed on or which lead to people not surviving to pass on their genes.
Right.
So it's technically a third potential mechanism for this kind of intergenerational trauma stuff.
Well, and that's really interesting. I hadn't actually heard that hypothesis before, which is really interesting because I work in healthcare. But on top of that, right, some of those intergenerational pieces that mixed together is absolutely. That, right? Like both if we have both and, right, that if there is something that is passed on genetically, whether that's from epigenetics or just genetics in general, that the conditions by which the group is exposed to, right, or behaviors that we are exposed to that continue to get passed on also make things worse, right? So we know, and this is me getting off on a little bit of a tangent around like the impact of how our brain and our body are connected, right? Yep. And so if let's say, for instance, specifically for the Black community here in the US, if this is part of the genetics that are passed down to us, having this like higher retention of salt, and we are exposed to higher levels of stress and trauma in our day-to-day life, those things are going to exacerbate each other, right? So how stress and trauma impact our body makes our body react more, right?
And can interact with other cultural things absolutely. Like, the literally just the seasoning of food, right? And then food preferences, right, which then pass on as well.
Yeah. And one of the other things I'm thinking about is the idea of John Henryism. Are you familiar with John Henryism?
Not off the top of my head.
So with this story with John Henry is that he's a formerly enslaved person and worked on the railways, and they now have machines that really did all of the work to put the railroads down.
Yeah.
And his goal was to beat the machine. And because he didn't want his job taken, right? Essentially. Yeah. And so he worked himself literally to death. He fixed it. He did it. He did beat the machine and worked incredibly hard. And within days, actually, he died. There's so many different ways in which different things that even if I haven't experienced this specific trauma, that the behavior, the different things, the ideas get passed down generation to generation that we then have to address and atone for as well. And there's this interesting quote I'm going to pull up really quick.
While you pull that up, it's so interesting. That's a story I grew up with. I remember I had some old animated movie with it, but I knew that story, and it's such a counter stereotypical story too, because the stereotype would say, oh, Black people, well, lazy. And right. It's really about extreme, like hardworkingness and overworking, like literally working yourself to death. Mm-hmm. And it's just interesting how some things kind of take off more broadly and don't, and others don't.
Yes. So again, I want to also make it very clear that intergenerational trauma hits all kinds of folks in different backgrounds. We talked a lot about Black African American here, but also Indigenous populations across the world, but particularly in the U.S. Again, Holocaust survivors. Thinking about Vietnam War and the exposure to the Agent Orange, all of those things have passed down different things to folks, which then currently also, and I said early on, contribute to the experience of collective trauma, right? Yes. And these things that are happening currently and how connected we are to it. So and using myself as an example, another Black example, but only because this is my own personal lived experience, post George Floyd, when things are happening, when it comes to policing, even if I personally am not or have not experienced something, or I am not connected or related to George Floyd, I feel it because they are part of my community. There's these things that we have been connected to through the intergenerations, through the collective, through our community.
Yeah. And adding to that, again, my lived experience. So it's going to be a gay example, but a few years back there was the mass shooting at the Pulse nightclub, and after that happened, I mean the gay community felt it, and part of this kind of collective trauma. It's not just it's a member of my community, but it could have been me. Stuff that George Floyd happened because of his skin color and because of his race, and the shooting at the Pulse nightclub was because of who they are, their identities. And I remember after the Pulse nightclub shooting, there was some kind of pride event that Eric Roman and I and our friends had all been planning on going to. And, Eric Roman was very upset about it. And he was like, I'm mad that I'm even thinking this, but maybe I don't want to go to this pride event because there could be another shooting. Right. And we do know from kind of history, actually, sometimes these things have domino effects. Right. There are copycats. Right. There are, this is something we see on college campuses. That's a serious issue. So little content warning. We're about to talk about suicide. But when someone commits suicide and it's very publicized, often other people who've maybe been having those kinds of thoughts, it encourages them. And so you sometimes see, anyway, lots of negative things can have. For sure. But this idea of collective trauma, the effect, this is part of the reasoning behind hate crime legislation as well, which was a big area of stuff that I studied and work with, in addition to studying prejudice-based aggression, which is the fancy science term for kind of hate crime aggression and bullying. And so with hate crimes, the idea is it's not just the harm on the one person or people, but on that whole community. And so some people are like, well, why is there an extra law that's so why is it worse to kill a gay person or a black person than it is a straight or a white person? And so it's not that. Of course, the human loss is terrible in either case, but it's this idea of collective trauma that it's motivated by hate and affects a whole community. And then the collective trauma, when you add then the intergenerational trauma, so the collective trauma that we experience, we pass on to future generations of our people.
100%. And so I mentioned earlier, there's this really great TED Talk, and I'm going to apologize right now that I'm probably not going to say her name correctly. But it is called Trauma Not Transformed is Trauma Transferred. And I'm going to say it again because I think it's really important as we think about what we do with this idea of collective or intergenerational or trauma in general, is thinking about that we still have to address it, right? Trauma not transformed is trauma transferred. And her name is Tabitha Impira Kaguri. And again, I apologize. I know I did not say that well. And I tried to look it up to see if I could see her saying her name. And I cannot find anything that shows her saying her name.
I can vouch. Amber was doing a lot of research just trying to find out that pronunciation. So she tried hard.
I did. But one of the stories that she tells is, there are a couple of things. One of the stories that she tells is how this little girl is watching her mother cook turkey. Yep. And as she's cooking this turkey, she's cutting off bits and pieces, like the legs, and she's cutting pieces off as she's doing it. And the little girl asks her mom, why do you cut this off? Why do you cut all of these things off? She goes, I don't know. That's how my mother did it. And so then they go to her mother and talked why did you do this? And this is how my family did it. And as they kind of started to look into it, they found out I only did that because my pan wasn't big enough, right?
So the grandmother, as they go up the generations, the pan and I think maybe the oven wasn't big enough to hold the whole turkey.
To hold the whole turkey. And so then that's the only reason why they cut all this stuff. But all this time they're wasting all this really good food and meat and doing it differently when it was just because this is this thing that was passed down generation to generation of how we do things, but it was functional at one point and now has become something that's not functional, or we don't need to do things in this way anymore.
It reminds me of functional and also kind of a structural problem, so to speak, not exactly the way we use that word, but the structure of the cooking pan or the oven given,
Right.
was something that the grandmother or grandmother was facing. That's no longer an issue. Yeah.
That's no longer a limitation. And so but we still hold on to some of these things and that we need to address it. So Tabitha, I'm just going to use her first name because I can pronounce that one appropriately. She talks about trauma and intergenerational trauma as this like relay race, right? We get past the baton from our family and generations beforehand. And our job is to recognize what those batons are. What are we being passed from our family? What are the narratives? What are the things? What are the traumas? What are the behaviors? What are the things that we're taking from each generation, from generation to generation? And our job is then we get to decide whether or not we're holding that on or how we're changing it or what we're doing with this baton.
Yeah. And this is kind of a repeat, but slightly different kind of story. So I'm not going to say who it is because I don't have their consent, but I know of someone who has this story through the generations of their family. Let's say 3 generations back, and this involves abuse. So also content warning for that. If that's sensitive for you, that's what I'm going to talk about for the next 30 seconds to a minute. This guy's great grandfather was very physically abusive and actually killed his son by beating him. The son was dead and then got resuscitated. And then the next generation, the next generation of parents when they became parents, also kind of hit their kids, but maybe not as bad.
Right.
And so they were like, I got hit a lot, so I'm going to hit my kids as my form of discipline, but maybe weren't as violent.
Right.
Then the next generation, kind of the same thing, but it reduced to kind of just spanking, not the beatings. And then it gets to the generation of the person who I'm thinking of, who's just like, it ends with me. Physical discipline is not the way to go. Yeah. And so when you were talking about the baton, it made me think of that. So where the abuse or the way of disciplining was kind of passed on, but got a little lighter each. And so, it's not just as simple as the baton metaphor kind of implies, where it's not exactly the same. Sometimes our coping and changing mechanisms alter it, where it might not be recognizable in the same way for some of the things. And this is a case of it getting better and better. Sometimes it gets worse and worse, depending on what the thing is. But there are different ways to think about it. So I want to encourage you as the listeners to kind of examine some of these things. I'm going to tell you in story time later about one from my family, but sometimes discovering these things, you don't realize it until you compare to another family, and you're like, oh wait, you don't do things this way? What?
Oh, I had no idea that was weird.
So and you were starting to, and I kind of derailed you a little bit, but we were starting to talk about kind of how do we heal from this, and this is something I'm very interested in hearing from you about. One that I'm just going to throw out there briefly is the idea of, when healing from this kind of intergenerational stuff, there are kind of 2 places that I want you to think, the listeners, to kind of think about looking into your family for that kind of healing, which can very much be a source of that, even if you kind of were learning this trauma from them, coming together on that, but also looking outside of your family, because sometimes you have to kind of get out of the situation to really be able to evaluate that. And that brings up the idea of chosen family, which you've talked about sprinkled here or there, but sometimes having chosen family, people, friends who are so close to you that they're kind of they're part of your family and your heart, are a really good place for that kind of healing to help recognize, see how you maybe want to do things differently. In the case of the LGBT community, that's a really huge thing because, you generally won't be sharing your LGBT status with your parents in 99 out of 100 cases. And so the collective trauma as well, that chosen family healing can be important.
100%. Well, and that's part of what one of the things of healing is community and community healing, and finding your people, especially others that have similar background or identity markers or whatever that is, similar experiences, that in and of itself, being around other people where you are reminded that, like, this is true, this is valid, the way that you're feeling right now, while maybe somebody who is not part of this community or has not experienced this they might think that this is an overreaction or an overreach or whatever. They kind of, to use a term that's really big right now, gaslight you, right? They kind of gaslight you into thinking like this is just a you problem, like you need to get it together. But if you are around other people who have had a similar experience, similar histories or similar identities, and they're like, no, boo, like, this is how I feel that way too, or this is how I'm feeling, that helps ground you. And it is it's an important means of healing.
And that's so well said. Thank you for that. And this idea of collective healing brings up another topic that I want to draw people's attention to. So after George Floyd, this is something that happened a lot. So on university campuses where people were kind of reasoning with that, and other kinds of the Pulse Night Club shooting and things. Sometimes there are kind of resource centers that pull together kind of healing circle sort of events. That depending on how you word things can rub some people the wrong way. So there was one, I won't be too specific, but on a campus I was involved with, a major event like a George Floyd had happened, and they were bringing together kind of a healing event. And there were kind of two separate ones, one for members of that community. So they're like, hey, for members of the Black African-American community, this is your event. And then for other members of the community, there was a separate event. And the way they worded it, it just sounded very segregationist, like, and like they could have worded it a little bit better or explained why they were doing it. But exactly what you're saying is the reason for it, for the Black people to come together to share their common experiences related to that and the healing related to that. And having people who are not members of their community, that changes the dynamic in a way that would make the healing not as effective potentially, or the collective experience very different.
Yeah. And those spaces are so important. Affinity spaces are so important. And they do have to be handled with care and attention, especially if it's facilitated in that way. Because if it's not framed appropriately, then it just feels like, well, why are you segregating the brown people from everybody else? And why do the white people have to just, it's like the book, like, why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria, right? Like this doesn't make any sense. Why would we do this? So it has to be handled with a lot of care and attention, of saying like, this is why we're creating these spaces, and even maybe giving opportunity for collective with both communities, right? With all the communities together.
And so I want to encourage our listeners. I mean, I think if they've gotten this far in the podcast, they're probably pretty thoughtful about these kinds of things. But if you're ever in that, if you ever see an event like that or something like that happens, I think there are white folks who get really offended. There are also Black and brown folks who get really offended if it's not handled with care, as you're saying. But if you're ever a part of that or hear that kind of thing, you're like, whoa, wait, think about this conversation about like, what are the people in the various groups going through? How do these collective traumas affect them differently, and therefore the collective healing might need to look a little different. And not just with race, but could be gender related violence, LGBT, also things that aren't violence, but there's other forms of trauma. So just as always, 100%. Being thoughtful is something we encourage.
Absolutely.
Hey everyone, we now have Diverse Joy merch available for purchase. There are Diverse Joy mugs that are dishwasher and microwave safe, some really nice large tote bags that are great for grocery shopping, very cozy embroidered hoodies, and a variety of comfy t-shirts. I was wearing one of the t-shirts in the airport recently, and several people stopped me to say how happy it made them to see it. People are hungry for joy around diversity topics, so get some merch and help us spread the joy. There are also free downloadable bingo cards if you want to play Diverse Joy Bingo with our common topics and phrases. Get all of these at biashabit.com/store, or just go to diversejoy.com and click the store link. All proceeds go toward helping us produce the show, and you can also make a donation to our nonprofit through the site to help us out even more. Now, back to the show. All right, so Amber, welcome back from break, everyone. You have this quote that you would like to share.
Yeah, so, in thinking about, again, addressing the intergenerational trauma or these things, it's not specifically about intergenerational trauma, but it is in a lot of ways. So I'm sure I've talked about this book before, but the book is called Cast by Isabel Wilkerson.
Is that cast with an E at the end?
With an
like
E at the
caste
end.
system?
Like a caste system. It's a fantastic book. It was very timely when it came out, right at the beginning, right in 2020, when everything was going on, both politically, geopolitically, like the pandemic, like so many different things that were going on. And really what she does is she talks about race as a caste system in the US and racism and race in general as a caste.
Race is you said race is and I thought you
racism. No, race as a caste system,
Gotcha. Okay.
as in other countries. And so she very rarely, if ever, uses the word race, but it's a fantastic book. Would definitely recommend it. But anyway, in this, she talks about how we have to kind of address the ills, whether that's the ills of a society or personally. And so it's kind of a long quote, but I'm going to read it anyway. She says, "When we go to the doctor, they will not begin to treat us without taking our history. And not just our history, but that of our parents and grandparents before us. The doctor will not see us until we have filled out many pages on a clipboard that has been handed to us upon arrival. The doctor will not hazard a diagnosis until they know the history going back generations. As we fill out the pages of our medical past and our current complaints, what our bodies have been exposed to and what they have survived, it does us no good to pretend that certain ailments have not beset us, to deny the full truths of what brought us to this moment. Few problems have ever been solved by ignoring them. Looking beneath the history of one's country specifically is like learning that alcoholism or depression runs in one's family, or that suicide has occurred more often than might be usual, or with advances of medical genetics, discovering that one has inherited the markers of BRCA mutation for breast cancer. You don't ball up in a corner with guilt or shame at these discoveries. You don't, if you are wise, forbid any mention of them. In fact, you do the opposite. You educate yourself. You talk to people who have been through it and specialists who have researched it. You learn the consequences and obstacles and options of treatment. You may pray over it or meditate over it, but then you take precautions to protect yourself and succeeding generations and work to ensure that these things, whatever they are, don't happen again. And I really, really like that. One, again, she's really framing it from a country, national perspective of let's look at the ails of our country and how they've been passed down generation to generation as a whole nation. But I think that it's a really good analogy of how we need to think about that for ourselves individually, for our communities, for our spaces, of thinking about how do we, one, first acknowledge. And then we're talking about how do we heal from intergenerational trauma or these collective traumas? Yeah. How do we work through them? One is first by acknowledging that it exists and taking the time to look at how is this manifesting in my own life? Like, where does this come from? Why did I react this strongly to this thing? Or where does this behavior or this thought process come from? Oh, this is how my mom or my parents or my family handled it. Well, why did they do it, right? Asking the questions, getting some education and figuring that out. Getting the support that you need, whether that is from your community, which is an important part, like I said before, is that getting in and leaning into your community, and that getting that community healing is an important piece, but also for your own self, whether that's through therapy, which obviously I'm a clinical psychologist, so I'm a huge advocate for getting into therapy and making sense of what that means for you and how it manifests. Yeah. That's a really, really important part. And then I also think that like finding ways in which you can be the healing force too. Yep. I think I talked about before that like advocacy, finding small means of moving the barometer, shifting the needle, is also really personally healing too. Yes.
So if I can kind of underline some of this, I mean, this comes back to our core habit breaking model. Right. So the MATE acronym. Mm-hmm. So you have to have motivation. So be motivated to address and heal from this kind of trauma. Awareness, which is understanding how it plays out, which you just described beautifully, like understanding understanding what it means for you, how you came to learn these patterns, and how it's showing up in your life. Tools, therapy being one of the possible tools, but also kind of the collective chosen family, kind of collective healing sorts of things. And then the working little bit at a time that you were just saying is the effort over time, the Absolutely. E. So motivation, awareness, tools, effort. I mean, good model that we keep coming. Like, I don't know if you were planning it that way, but everything you said, I was like, yep, motivation, awareness, tools, effort. There you go.
I mean, I'm just that brilliant. What can I say? No, I'm just kidding.
but no, it's good. You know, we usually talk about that model in terms of changing habits of mind to reduce bias within yourself, but then to use it to address trauma in this way too. You know,
absolutely. Yeah. And again, I think that it's important for us as folks that are practitioners, folks that really care about diversity, that we're thinking about it for ourselves, for our community, but also those that we're interacting with, right? And keeping that in mind, that some of their reactions, maybe even towards me, are also may be influenced by some of the intergenerational trauma or experiences. And one of the experiences we started to talk about, example that I give is when I was working at a hospital in Baltimore.
Oh, yeah.
And when I was working in Baltimore, you know, it's a very big hospital, and I'll just say the name. It's Johns Hopkins, which is a world-renowned hospital, and also has had a history of experimentation on like Black folks, and Henrietta Lacks being one of the most famous kind of experiences. And I remember going and working with even Black patients, right? As a city that is 60% Black, and as a Black presenting and a Black practitioner coming in, that by me bearing the name Johns Hopkins, right, I am now connected to this history,
to the establishment
of the history of that establishment. And so even when I have Black patients coming in, while they were incredibly excited, I can't even describe to you how excited folks were to see that I was their provider, and how, and we also mentioned aunties, which we'll talk about more later, but that they really saw me as their family, right? And that my success was their success, right? Like, oh my God, you're my doctor. And they would just like touch their arm. Like I wasn't expecting you, right? Yeah. And, but on the same hand, that I'm wearing the badge of Hopkins and all of the history. So when people are coming in, they're seeing the Hopkins first in a lot of ways. So even though I might be approaching them differently, and I'm still having to overcome and create a sense of safety because I'm still part of that history.
And you know, what you're talking about is a combination of the collective and the intergenerational.
Yes. Yep.
So the people you're talking about, they were probably personally never experimented on.
Right.
It's possible that maybe some of their ancestors, family members were, but also not necessarily. Right. It was the Black community. That's the collective part. Right. And it was the Black community at least a generation ago for the most part. So collective and intergenerational. I also something I want to underline about that. So Johns Hopkins in academic, and I'm just going to underline white academic circles, you know, it's one of the best places. And so this is how we met when I presented at a conference there, and it was a visiting professorship. Right. And so like I have on my CV, and I have, because I'm like, this is such a fancy, like it's something for me to be proud of, where it's like, I had a visiting professorship at Johns Hopkins University. That means something in these academic circles. Right. And it's this kind of halo. It's this great thing that I have, but without knowing you, I don't know that I mean, I guess I do know the Black history of bad things that have happened, but not realizing, like, to me, that's the past. Without having you to provide some of this context for me, it's like, oh yeah, well, I know that like researchers everywhere have done bad things in the past. Like we didn't used to have ethics stuff, but to me, it's just like Johns Hopkins A plus.
Great.
But seeing how an institution, its reputation can be so different from different perspectives, and that isn't our main topic, but just to something to highlight that, you know, and the joy of different perspectives, like we talked a little bit about last time with Sandy. The joy of kind of discovering something. It's like, oh, of course, the way I see things isn't the way everyone else is going to see them.
Right. And again, that's really important as we're interacting with folks, even something that can be something really positive for you. I also was trained there, so I have that on my CV. I also have had a visiting professorship that means something in a lot of contexts. And it is also really important for me to be aware of what that means to the community and certain communities, and not to say that it's not still a really great thing and a really great space. I just have to be responsible to know, like, what extra work might I need to do to overcome some of this intergenerational pieces.
As should we
all. And so I think that that's something that we don't always think about, right? It's not something that we always think about. What is the history of the space that I'm entering in? Or even this, it's not totally tangential, but thinking about, you know, again, native land. We do like land acknowledgements and things like that to acknowledge the land. But that is insufficient, right? To just say I'm acknowledging the land
and to do it now. We are currently recording on Ho-Chunk Nation land which is now called Madison, Wisconsin. It was land that was never ceded by the Ho-Chunk Nation, but was taken by white settlers. I think we've mentioned that once before, but if I haven't, I apologize for not doing it sooner. But it's acknowledging, but
it's one half of it, right? Like one part of it is that we have to absolutely do the acknowledgement, and that is something. And what else can we be doing? How can we also be giving back? How can we be pouring money into the people? What is the reparative side or the responsive side, right? Yeah. So I think acknowledging is the first step, and then the next step is I have to do something about it, right? I have to do something, even if I'm not giving back the land to I don't have the power, or I don't have the authority to give the land back. But I can be giving money. I can be not just acknowledging, I can be pouring resources. I can be finding ways to give back in other ways.
Can be amplifying Indigenous voices.
Exactly.
In the ways that you have the power to do so.
Absolutely. Yeah.
As we talked about before, like we talked about looking into your own talents and how can you use them for the betterment of others. Absolutely. You know, what areas do you have where you can amplify underrepresented voices? We're continuing on a bit of a tangent, but just last night, Eric Roman and I took Amber to what's called Concerts on the Square. And met a friend of ours who's also a listener, Bill. And, you know, Bill works in interior design, which is not something we would usually think of as being where DEI, diversity, Jedi kind of work happens. Right. But he was asking us, he was like, what can I do to amplify underrepresented voices for Indigenous people, for Asian American and Pacific Islanders and so on, and looking to us to see what he can do in that industry, in interior design. And it was an interesting conversation.
Yeah.
And,
well, that is just the voice and the representation is so missed in this field, which in a lot of ways makes sense. But it's not necessarily something that I would have explicitly thought of in that way. And again, that goes to the responsiveness. So when we're thinking about trauma, when we're thinking about collective trauma, when we're thinking about any of these things, not just for myself, I want to acknowledge it for myself, but I want to acknowledge it for the space that I'm in. And I also want to find ways of responding. How do I shift what I'm doing, how I'm saying, what I'm amplifying, where I'm putting money to respond to what is happening in that space?
Yeah. And Eric Rome shared an idea in response to Bill's question. We should have saved Bill's question for the question portion of a future episode, because it was a good one.
It's a great one.
But for in the context of interior design, Eric Roman came up with the answer that sourcing art pieces from members of those communities would be a great way to do it. So with the kind of Ho-Chunk land, just to stick with that, because we're talking about Madison, Wisconsin right now. As you're working on it, you know, find a native Indigenous artist support their work in that kind of in
Mm-hmm.
that kind of interior design kind of capacity.
And partner with and find the ways to amplify their influence and their voice in what you're doing. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right.
Anyway.
So do we have more on the discussion topic before we want to move into story time?
I mean, I could talk about this all day, and we've already said lots. So I think that we can move on to our stories.
Great. Awesome. So as always, we have a more negative story and a more positive story, as everyone knows. The stories don't always fully link to the main topic, but they do today.
Yeah.
So the more negative story comes from my family. So we've mentioned the Chinese Exclusionary Act a few times. It was a law in the U.S. that banned people of Chinese descent from serving in the military, from serving in the government, from attending schools. And it was a very racist law or policy. And as the listeners and viewers may remember, my mother is of Native Hawaiian, but also Chinese descent, Native Hawaiian, Chinese, and Portuguese. And then the the Chinese and the Portuguese aspects of our family ancestors all have been in Hawaii since the 1850s. And Hawaii is very much that kind of melting pot of the settlers and the Native Hawaiians and so on. I'm babbling a little bit, okay. But the Chinese ancestors, including my great grandfather, were then subject to this Chinese Exclusionary Act. And my great-grandfather, whose last name was Shisek, and I'm sure I am pronouncing that wrong, but it's spelled Hee space SECK. That's the lineage, at least as close to me as it went, our last name. Wanted to join the military, and was excluded because of that. And he was Chinese and Hawaiian, but had the Chinese last name. And so he changed his last name. So he was married to my great grandmother, who was, as far as we're aware, full-blooded Native Hawaiian, and created a new last name. And that is actually our Hawaiian last name. So it's Auna, means the gathering. It was my mom's last name, or my mom's maiden name. And so he had to change his name in order to kind of essentially pass as Hawaiian, not Chinese, in order to go into the military. And now in terms of the intergenerational piece, there was something that I always knew about my family, but didn't really know the reasoning behind it. Kind of like the cutting up the turkey example that you shared. So my auntie and uncles and my mom, they all had different names in the family versus outside of the family. So my Auntie Perry, I knew her as Auntie Perry. Her siblings and her parents call her Perry, but her legal name is Vianne. My mom, so within the family, like with my mom, my dad, and so on, knew her by her first name, Valen, which is her legal first name. But when we were with the extended family, she was Auntie Bibi, and everyone like called her Bibi. And so basically my mom and her siblings had different names inside the family versus outside the family. And when I learned the story from my grandfather, talking about his father, I kind of connected those two things. It's like, oh wait, like in the family, we're ourselves, it's safe, it's closer. And then you have these kind of very formal names outside the family. And as with many of these intergenerational trauma things, I cannot say that it is 100% because of this thing. Like as a scientist, I'm like, well, I need data. Like I need to know that someone made a decision at some point. But there definitely is a feeling of it's the idea of passing. So my mom can pass for white, you know, depending on how she does her hair or makeup and so on. She can also pass for very Asian or very Hawaiian. Like I have images of her in my head as in all of these kind of categories. Something that kind of maybe racially more ambiguous people have. And when it all clicked, it did just all make sense to me. And so this idea that going back what is that, 3 generations
Right.
to my great grandfather, that this racist law made our family start doing this thing that then carries forward.
Yeah.
Now, it wasn't as explicit in my generation, but my family doesn't call me Will.
Yeah.
My family calls me Taylor, which is my second name.
Interesting. Okay.
And at some point in school, I started going by my actual first name, which is Will. None of them call me Will.
Interesting.
It's Taylor. And that includes all my extended family.
Yeah. Wow. Well, and I think that's, thank you for sharing, Will. I think we see that really explicit type of intergenerational trauma happens a lot. The passing thing, right? And that the internal versus external, and what's okay at home and what's not okay from public facing spaces. And we see it. I think one of the most explicit examples is in particularly Native American and indigenous populations, that there's a protective part of being able to pass as white. But then the intergenerational pieces of that is also the loss of culture and loss of connection, loss of
if
those
you're emphasizing
things.
passing so much, how you display, how you do your hair, how you do, absolutely.
Right. And that, we see a lot of folks, and particularly our generation, and Gen Z, really trying to reclaim the history and the language and those things, but a lot have being lost just because of the trauma experience and these anti-Black and racist and exclusionary laws and practices before. So yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing that. It's sad, but a really good example of exactly what we're talking about. So my story is maybe on the more positive side.
How do we heal from these?
Again,
what are
going back to the
heal?
ways in which we heal some of the collective and community and intergenerational trauma. And I've talked a lot about, or I've talked a few times about my nonprofit, Forest Bias Kinship Coalition. But that really came out of a time, the whole purpose of building this nonprofit was specifically to address the experiences of Black youth in Oregon, and particularly rural Oregon. And for me, as somebody who grew up in that space, and I've said several times that my mom was amazing. She did a really great job of exposing us and finding spaces where we could know what it meant to be Black. And we were in spaces that there just weren't people like us, right? There just wasn't anybody that looked like us. We didn't have that sense of that community. And so it was bred out of this place of saying, like, how can I give back? I talked about the ways in which we can heal from trauma is giving back to the community, finding those ways where we can change the needle. And so building this mentorship program is this way of being able to say, like, I want to mitigate the harm of not having a sense of community, giving back and creating a space that will help the youth of today create the community and the coping mechanisms and all of the things that they need to be equipped with, the things that I didn't have, that I didn't get, or that I had to learn in other ways. I want it to be more accessible for them. I want them to be able to have aunties and uncles that look like them, that they can go to, that their families, that their parents, whether they're Black, white, or otherwise, to also have a community of people that they can come to us when racist things are happening to them at school, or they have things that are said to them, that now we have built this space that is a collective, that is a community, that is a healing space for them. And again, going back to that place where they can be grounded. They can be grounded in reality. Like, that thing that person said, that wasn't great. And this is how we go about, and this is what we do. This is how we handle it. This is how I have personally managed it when things like this have been said. And then again, equipping parents also to how to navigate the school system and those kinds of things. So it is not a specific example, but as far as a one-to-one, but it is this idea of how we created this nonprofit, this organization where we are intentionally building it to center also center joy and not the trauma. Because oftentimes when we're marginalized folks get together, it's very easy to center the trauma and not the joy. And so the whole purpose of this is to say, like, we're here to support the trauma when it happens, but we're here to center the joy.
But also you to give you more credit than you're giving even more credit than you're giving yourself. In a past episode, you actually shared a very specific example, the going to HBCUs.
Right. Yeah.
So for you couldn't picture yourself there and didn't even apply.
Yeah.
You remembered that for yourself, and that's part of what you went on those trips with your kiddos so that they could see, oh, I could belong here. So right there, the Black person growing up in white Oregon,
right?
That was a collective kind of trauma or similar experience that could have been just passed on, but because you experienced it and then looked back and had hindsight about it, you helped them with coping skill, or not even a skill, a tool though, going and visiting and feeling exposure, that they can be there. So you intergenerationally and collectively helps heal or prevent some of that harm. And I think that's beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So we're going to take one last break. Then we'll get back with our question and our skill and wrap things up to our recommendation.
Sounds good.
Dance break.
Okay. Yeah. Welcome back. And we're going to jump right into our question. So we got this question from an audience member and listener, and I think it's a really great question. Essentially, what they're asking is, they said that they grew up in a space that was particularly racist, and a racist family and household that really infused a lot of kind of more bigoted ideas. And so the question is, how do I navigate that? How do I navigate coming from a family that instills these things and continues to have some of those thoughts and beliefs while also trying to shift and change my thoughts and ideas?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for sending it in. Also, all the rest of you, please continue sending in your questions. Yes. You can do that at diversejoy.com. Also, your ideas and stories. So with this question about how to kind of be better when you grew up in a kind of very racist space, I think, it's really everything we talk about in the skills section. Yeah. So all these tools about how to kind of rewire some stuff, broadening your input and so on. So think through that. But I think if you're already at the point of recognizing that your upbringing and your context was especially racist, you're kind of already doing the work. Yeah. You're already recognizing it. And I think it's just putting a little bit of extra effort and care. Yeah. So a lot of what we've talked about, how we learn these bias habits, is kind of ordinary. So it's not necessarily from having a super racist family. It's everyone learns that kind of stuff. Yeah. But if there's that kind of extra force, extra kind of turning up of the racist flames behind what you learned, then I think you just need to meet it with an equal but opposite force of putting extra work in. And I want to encourage you, the person who submitted this, and everyone to kind of think about that stuff. Yeah. And it just means, doing the same kinds of stuff we've been talking about and just putting that effort in and believing that it can work, and believing that you can work against those things over time.
Yeah. Yeah. I think anytime that you are you're dealing with a family members, it does come back to this, like the E of mate, right? The effort over time. Yeah. And figuring out what is my relationship with my family. One, doing your own personal work, continuing to and do that. But then as you're navigating working with your family, is thinking about, like, how do I, what do I want my relationship to be? And if I want to maintain my relationship with my family, going in guns a-blazing, to use a colloquialism, may not be something that your family really appreciates. And so how do I navigate that? And I think finding those, another bingo term for us is I like to say successive approximations. Those small things of how can I have constructive conversations that aren't blowing up into full-blown arguments all the time, but small ways in which you can share your perspective or to kind of add those things. And that effort and diligence over time, we often can see shifts in our family members, or even if maybe their thoughts, their views don't totally shift, they may be able to shift and change the ways in which at least they're interacting with you and the boundaries that you're setting with them as well. And so, but I do believe that over time, we can see shifts in our family, but I think that you have to be really intentional about how you're going in and what kinds of conversations and how you're having those conversations with them.
Yeah, and I want to, if you haven't listened to last month's episode, so that's episode 9 of season 2 with special guest Sandy Eichel, they modeled something really well, I think. So I believe it was one of the stories, they talked about setting boundaries and saying, first off, with a difficult person, it wasn't within a family, but a similar sort of thing, like, first off, the boundary is we have to treat everyone with respect, that all humans have value and aren't less than. And this idea of kind of a very racist family, I think if you can think of what is that core value that is important to you that maybe be a disconnect with your family. So if something racist starts happening, you can say, I believe that regardless of skin color, people are of equal value and worth and respect. And like we just, can't violate that boundary, or I am not comfortable with anything otherwise. And sometimes, the racism, people are saying racist things, but they aren't saying, I believe black people are less than. And so by putting out like, my belief is this, and what you're saying violates that, having it just kind of direct and clear, they can't handle that. I think, or they didn't realize that what they were saying implied that. And so I think if you can think through things ahead of time, thinking ahead being one of the tools we talk about, and based on what I have planned, it's one of the things we're going to talk about again next month for our skill. Thinking ahead, this is what I believe, this is how I want to say it to my family. And being clear on that ahead of time can help it. Because once you're in the moment, things are emotional, things get heated. But if you can think it through ahead of time, it
makes a difference. 100%.
And as far as kind of changing these deeply held beliefs, this is stories from my life that I've told before. My family was extraordinarily anti-gay. The Mormon Church does not like the LGBT community. I think some people will talk about how they've made progress. To me, I don't think they have. They still fundamentally believe it's a sin and that gay relationships are not valid. But my family threw me out for being gay. That's kind of the height of kind of extreme prejudice. But over the years, exposure to me, understanding that this wasn't just some choice, something I was going to change. Maybe it took 20 years, but now they are very accepting. They love Eric Roman, and so accept him as a true. Accept him as a son. I can personally attest to the fact that that kind of change is possible, but does take time and effort.
Yes. Yep. And that's the thing is like not getting discouraged by recognizing that it's going to take some time and effort to get to some maybe successive approximations or some movement.
And it is your choice.
Absolutely.
Going lower contact or no contact with your family is also an option.
100%. And again, that's important, right? To say, what are my boundaries? And if my family is unable to respect those boundaries, that it's also okay to limit what they have access to, or limit what your contact with them too.
Right. Well, thanks again for sending it in.
Yeah, it was a great question. Thank you. So, Will, that being our question, and we mentioned a few of the skills already, but what is our skill specifically for today's episode?
So our skill for today is one of those tools. It's one we've mentioned in different forms before. This is a tool that there are many different ways to use it. So it's broadening your input. So we've talked about this before last season in terms of broadening your input via the media.
Right.
That's something we do every episode with our recommendation at the end. We've also talked about it in terms of broadening your input through contacts.
Yep.
Several episodes back, or many episodes back now, I told the story of how Amber and I met as one way to kind of illustrate this. Having, meaningful people in your life who are from kind of different social groups is another way to broaden your input. We also talked about kind of being mindful of your input as the kind of precursor to this, where we learn these biases and stereotypes. So we're going to talk about broadening your input through images in the environments, and yet another way to do this. But all of these different ways, they're synergistic. So what I mean by broadening your input through images in the environment is that our environments are replete with images, full of images that whether explicitly or more unintentionally or implicitly, relay ideas about who's important, whose perspectives are valued, who belongs. Yeah. So think about at whatever your work is, what are the images on your website, the kind of people in those images? Or when you look around, what kind of art do you see and who are the artists and what are they representing? Yeah. And these kinds of images in the environment historically and in many spaces, particularly I'm talking in a US context, but not just here, are going to be historically powerful group members. So more often men, more often white, more often straight, and so on. And what this is about being intentional about how to kind of increase representation. Right. As people like to say in culture, and I don't think we've said it very much this season, but last season it was definitely one of our bingo squares. Yeah. Representation matters. Right. 100%. And so to the extent in both your physical and your digital environments, see what you can do to increase representation of underrepresented groups. Yeah. One big example of this that I like to share, a colleague of mine does this with her computer screensaver.
I love that.
So she really cares in particular about combating stereotypes about women of color in the sciences, who we very often don't see as represented as much. And so she made a screensaver for all her computers that's women of color scientists, has a picture of them with next to the picture a little description of some of their important contributions to their area of science, maybe something about their lives. Right. And so whenever her computer goes to sleep and she's, sitting in her office or whatever, she can kind of look over at it and be reminded of these great women of color scientists. All of that is this input. Again, we're trying to broaden the input into your brain, into your cognitive systems. All that's input that helps push back against the narrow stereotypes, against the biases, and so on. And our longtime listeners will remember some of the other skills and some of the awareness skills we've talked about, such as attentional spotlight, where your brain's attentional processes are going to be drawn away from people who violate stereotypes, like these women of color scientists. Confirmation bias, where your brain, even when its attention is drawn to these counter stereotypic or stereotype disconfirming examples, your brain doesn't hold them as tightly in memory, and so on. And untested assumptions is the other kind of big way that our brains try to ignore evidence that might counteract stereotypes. Right. This is a direct way to contradict all of that. It's giving you more input. It's a dosage effect where you're increasing your dosage to your brain, the input to your brain of these people who counteract stereotypes to push back against all those processes. And I want you to think about many different ways to do this. So digital images, things on your phone, things in physical environments like art that I mentioned. As I was talking about this once, I was giving my full bias habit breaking training with a group of chemists. One of the people, he has a social media account where he posts stuff related to chemistry and so on. And his profile picture was, I believe, Pasteur. So, white male chemist. Right. But there are also lots of amazing female chemists and chemists of color. And he was like, oh, right now. And he changed the image from Louis Pasteur to a woman chemist. That's, one kind of way to do this. Also, I want people to think about, so if you're an academic, I know we have a lot of academics in the audience, your syllabi, your syllabuses. Right. So when you have a bunch of readings for a course, look through what kinds of people are represented there. Yep. I had one person who shared that, they wanted to get more authors of color in their syllabuses. And they actually weren't sure how to do that at first, because what they were taught, this is intergenerational stuff again,
and colonization.
Yeah. Their PhD advisors and stuff, they were familiar with particular particular papers that covered important topics. And so, of course, that's what they put in their syllabi.
Right.
And what they did to increase representation in this way and broaden the input of what they were teaching is they made it an assignment in their class.
Yeah.
They were like, everyone, we're trying to work on increasing representation. Find papers that make some of the same important points we covered in this class, but from a different author. Because as much as we scientists like to believe that we're very precious snowflakes and we're the only ones who could write the paper that we wrote, very often there are multiple papers that make very, very similar points, review similar literature, but from different kinds of authors.
Absolutely.
And so this professor made this assignment in his course. He had his grad students find papers sometimes it's from their own identities, from people who shared their own identities, and sometimes not. But he was then able the next semester to diversify his syllabus much better.
And it was also a good experience for the students as well to be able to go through that.
Yes. Absolutely. So finding the ways, so I said images in the environment, that was maybe readings in the environment, but similar kind of thing. Now, I've mostly emphasized this in terms of kind of working on our own biases. So like the screensaver example, that colleague of mine who's trying to work against the own biases in her mind. But if these are public facing things, so like the syllabus, like arts in a public space, and so on, it also has benefits for members of those groups.
Absolutely.
So one example I like to share, I fly all over the world giving our bias habit breaking training. And I fly with Delta, again, not branded content, just it happens to be. And in many of their jet bridges, Delta has these images of the types of people they imagine as their customers. And one of the images is a same-sex couple. It's two guys who are clearly kind of intimate with each other, kind of they're reading something together, looking at something together. And I'm like, that makes me feel good.
Right.
So as a gay man, every time I walk on the plane, I'm like, they care about the perspectives of folks like me. They want me as a customer because they're trying to appeal to me. And I also realize they might be putting themselves in a position to get hate from other people who hate people like me. Right. But they're still on my side on that issue. And I am not...
They're welcoming you there.
They're welcoming me. It's a signal to inclusion that they're increasing representation in these images. And also, I am not naive. I know that they are a corporation. They are capitalists. They probably think that it will help get them money.
Right.
And so with companies, when I'm talking about this, I also try to be aware of like, what are their policies for LGBT employees? Are they doing good things? Sure. Delta actually is and does. But the point being, those images are signals to inclusion, and members of those groups like seeing themselves represented, done in a respectful, thoughtful way, of course.
Absolutely. When I think about that, even in like offices, so as a clinical psychologist and an academic, how am I creating a space that is reflective of me, but also reflective of my values, and creating a space that allows people to see themselves or see that I'm welcoming them in my spaces, and also reminding myself. So I have lots of quotes from folks of all kinds of backgrounds in my office and images and things like that, that hopefully my students, when they would come into my office, or patients that come into my office, can see themselves reflected in different ways, right? Yeah. And it's also a reminder for me, how do I counteract any biases that I might have, or only have a singular input of Black creators or Black scientists or folks that I'm expanding my own input through message images and through quotes and things that I'm consuming on a day-to-day basis, but also are creating that space for people to see themselves reflected as well.
Absolutely. And I want to underline this idea of doing it genuinely and thoughtfully. So with all of our skills, I want to encourage you to apply them genuinely and thoughtfully. Right. It's not just kind of every problem is a nail, and so every tool is a hammer, and you just do what I say because I said to. It's doing it thoughtfully. So for instance, there's one bad example of someone doing this poorly. I mean, this is in the public eye, so I think I can just say what institution. UW-Madison, where I was when this happened. So it's a very white university, not exclusively, and I don't think it's much worse than other universities, but there was some promotional material that they were putting out, and it was a picture from a football game. And they very obviously photoshopped a Black person into the photo. And not that it would have been better if it were a good photo. Well, I guess it would have not that it would have been right if it were a good Photoshop,
Right.
but on top of it being a Photoshop, it was a bad Photoshop.
No.
It looked like they didn't even do it in Photoshop. They did it in like MS Paint, where they just cut out the picture of this black guy's face and just plastered it into this crowd of white students. Maybe Rowan can get an image of that for the video viewers, because it became a big issue because they found the news media found the black student who was pictured, and he was like, yeah, I was not at that football game. And it ended up he or a group he was associated with ended up suing the university, and they won. Eric Room says he found it. It's on Snopes and validated, right? How I'm telling the story. So we can cut me saying that out. It's widely known if you know these things. So he sued and won because, of course, they were misrepresenting him. But actually, he donated the money he won back to the university, earmarked specifically to create our Black Cultural Center, or Black Student Center, which we didn't have prior. We had a multicultural student center, but one devoted specifically for Black students. And programs related to supporting our Black students. So, like, frankly, if it had happened to me, if they were using me as gay representation or something in a way that I could have gotten money. I mean, I'd like to think I were that noble. I really do, but I'd be like, I'd keep some money. But he donated back to make things better for Black students at UW-Madison. But this is an example. Eric Rowan pulled up the image, which he'll put in the video, and Amber can.
Not only is he poorly photoshopped into the photo, but he's on the margin and then covered by a rule line.
Well, maybe that's how they were trying to hide the bad Photoshop, but they did not do well.
Oh, I see it. Wow.
That's just.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Sad. Well, sorry, I'm laughing about it a little bit, but inappropriate, and I'm glad that he stood up for it. I thought it was while I was at UW-Madison. I guess it was before. All right. Well.
2002.
Anyway, that's the intention behind it. I can see where it was probably like we're trying to show some diversity, trying to increase representation, but shoving someone in where they weren't attending that game. Not the way to do that. That is a misrepresentation.
Right. 100%.
And if you don't have actual representation, there are other ways to go about doing this. So I've mostly been talking about images of people, but it can also be things of slogans, statements of values, because there are many places where part of the problem is, we don't have the diversity yet. We don't have representation yet. But so like in a psychology department that I worked with, they had pictures of all their past faculty and their past faculty were male and white. And so like, what are they supposed to do with that when they didn't actually have the faculty yet? Well, what they ended up doing is they made a display where they're honoring psychologists from history, not just from their own department, and made sure there are lots of great Black psychologists, Asian psychologists, women psychologists, all of the above. And so they showcased those using this other kind of display that they built. So it was one way to do it in a way that's genuine, in a way that's thoughtful, inclusive, without trying to kind of fake something. I have more to say on this. I was mentioning, not just images of people, but values, statements, and things like that. This is also in a more everyday way. Like, we're not always in control of what our company does or our organization does, but people do things like they have stickers on their laptops or their notebooks or the back of their phone cases. They can be things that are about diversity, about inclusion, about stuff. And when others see that, like if I'm a gay student walking around on campus and I see a professor who has an LGBT related sticker on their laptop, I'm like, oh, this is a person who cares about folks like me. Also, if I'm ever having a problem, if I'm facing some kind of collective trauma, for instance, to go back, maybe I know that's a person I can go and talk to about it who will be more accepting.
One way I know I've noticed even in your house and your yard, you have the sign that says, right, in this house we believe Black Lives Matter, women's rights are human rights, no human is illegal, science is real, love is love, kindness is everything. And I think that that's another way, right, of saying like, here I'm making it really explicit what my values are and what I believe and who is welcome here. Like everyone, kindness is everything. Absolutely. And these are our values. And with these values, all of these things are also part of what we welcome to.
Exactly. So there are lots of different versions of that.
Oh, for sure.
People, and I wasn't fishing for you to give me a compliment on our yard sign, but yes, it does mean a lot to us, and it's something we put a lot of effort into. And people's email signatures,
right, for sure.
is one way that a lot of people can do this. Even statements like Black Lives Matter and so on. Think about that. But something we talked about with Sandy last time and other times, kind of displaying your pronouns.
Right.
That's one way to signal that, like, I've at least put a little bit of thought into my gender identity and someone who's trans or non-binary.
Right.
Like, there's actually research showing that people see that as a signal to inclusion. Yeah. In fact, not just LGBT people. In some of this research done by my colleague Megan Brunn, Black folks, people of color, seeing kind of someone displaying their pronouns, see that as a signal to inclusion related to race as well, because it shows some kind of thoughtfulness related to inclusion. So if someone's displaying their pronouns, they think, oh, they've also done some of the work related to kind of race bias or culture or other things. So that's something that's just so simple. If your gender identity and your pronouns, if they're not a big deal to you, displaying them can be a signal to inclusion for others. So images in the environment, slogans in the environment, and so on, both serve as a signal to inclusion for others and helps you work against your own biases. Even the pronoun email signature thing, every time you see your own email signature, it reminds you, these are my values. I care about these things. And it can be a reminder to double your efforts on working against biases, working for inclusion, and so on. This kind of feedback back loop. All these things start I'm losing my words. All these things kind of feed back to one another and have synergistic effects to kind of keep things going. And that's part of how this work of breaking bias habits gets easier and easier over time, because you get better and better at it by coming at it from all these different angles.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and I appreciate hearing the email signature thing, because it's definitely that's something that I do with pronouns, and then I also have like a link to for educational purposes, right? So like next to it says like, what's this? And it's links to like, what are pronouns? Why is this important? So for those that maybe don't know why I'm displaying my pronouns or what that means, it gives them an opportunity to kind of have some of that exposure. I also have a land acknowledgement and links for ways in which they can give back to Indigenous folks and Native Americans in my area specifically. So like, using all of those different ways and images and spaces to broaden your own input, but also the input of other folks that come across your space, whether that's your email or your office or your home.
Absolutely.
How else can we, or even like the clothes that you're wearing, right? Like, can you, being another image, are there artists or there's clothing lines or things jewelry that you can wear that's supporting another person group, that you can then broaden folks like cultural input or things, just by the things that you're wearing too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Right,
well, that's great. That's a great skill. Thank you, Will.
Absolutely.
Okay. So as we round out our episode, we have our recommendation. And Will, you've got a recommendation for us today.
I do. So this episode's coming out in May, and next month is going to be Pride Month.
Yes.
But for Pride Month, for the Pride Month episode, we actually have Nikki Vandermeulen coming back to talk about some really great stuff she's done. She was a past guest, and she's going to be talking about giving us some legal guidelines on kind of discrimination and what legal things we're allowed to say or not say or do or not do involving the hiring process. And so whenever we have a guest, we let them do the recommendation. Right. So this is my Pride Month recommendation, just a little bit early. You can watch it in anticipation of Pride Month. As you're getting excited for Pride Month, check out this movie. It's called Fire Island.
Okay.
So in case you don't know, Fire Island, it's an island up in New York or New Jersey, I think it might be. But
it's one of the news.
Yeah, especially during summer season, becomes kind of a little mini gay town. So a lot of LGBT people vacation there and kind of take it over. And this movie is kind of the story of one group of friends kind of doing that. And it is goofy, it's funny, it's surprisingly thoughtful. Like for the most part, it's a fun romp, but then there are a few conversations that the characters have that are really insightful, thoughtful, detailed. I'm going to look to Eric Roman Binding. It's loosely based on, I believe, a play or a piece of classic literature. He's going to look that up first. And one thing I haven't said about it yet is it's this group of friends I'm talking about. They're Asian, Asian and Asian American. And it's very rare that we see people of color represented in gay media. Gay media tends to be very white. And so this is one great exception to that. And again, watch it because it's just a great, funny, goofy movie. But also you'll end up kind of seeing some diversity within the gay Asian experience or Asian gay experience. This group of 4 or 5 gay guys have different perspectives on their role in the gay community and what it means to be Asian versus white in the gay community. And they have different personalities, different approaches to romance and things like that. Of course. Eric Roman did the research for me. Natural diversity among, we said in the previous episode, Black people are not a monolith. Asian people are not a monolith. And even getting another intersection in there, Asian gay men are not a monolith. And I think they do such a thoughtful, interesting, but all around entertaining, joyful exploration of this. And the general plot line is inspired by Pride and Prejudice.
Okay.
Thanks for looking that up, Roman. It also has Margaret Cho in it, who's a hilarious comedian. And she's kind of their auntie. Back to our, maybe that'll be another Diverse Joy Bingo Square. We're talking about aunties.
Yes, I love it.
She's kind of their lesbian auntie. And
it's got Bo and Yang, if I remember right. So for those of you that watch SNL, because I remember him talking about, I haven't seen this movie yet, so I need to watch it because it sounds amazing. But I do remember him talking about being in the movie. Yeah,
so funny, fun for everyone, not just for gay folks, not just for Asian folks. Anyone will, I think, find it very hilarious and interesting.
Awesome.
So check it out.
Yeah, check it out.
All right. I'm Dr. William Cox.
And I am Dr. Amber Nelson.
Diverse Joy is produced by Eric Roman Binding with music by Jay Arner. It is accessible as a video podcast on YouTube or an audio-only podcast wherever you get podcasts or at diversejoy.com. Follow us, check us out, subscribe to us at Diverse Joy on pretty much every social media platform. On Facebook, search for the Diverse Joy page. The URL is facebook.com/diversejoypodcast, all one word. Like and follow us. And what we do, I don't think we've said this before. Each month we put out like an additional extra picture or video related to something we talked about in an episode. So maybe something from my Star Warsified house from our Joy for this month, or pictures from when we went to Star Wars night from Amber's Joy, or things related to some of the topics we talk about. So if you follow us, you'll not only get info about when each episode drops, but also some additional things sprinkled throughout the month. If you enjoy the show, help us reach more people by leaving 5-star reviews in your podcasting apps or recommending it personally to others. Word of mouth, number one way that podcasts reach more people. So you can help us out. Diverse Joy is the official podcast of Inequity Agents of Change, a nonprofit devoted to evidence-based approaches to reduce bias, create inclusion, and promote equity. All that good Jedi work. Which we're dressed for this week.
I know what to say. It's very fitting.
And Jedi stands in this case for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. In addition to being a fictional thing that's owned by Disney. Learn more about our nonprofit at biashabit.com. Thank you for joining us. Now, go find your joy.
Bye.
Bye.